Intellectual History at MIT, and am the faculty lead of the Global Humanities Initiative. I welcome you all very much to the third forum. I'll start by talking a little bit about the Global Humanities Initiative for those of you who are new to it, and then we will proceed with the program. So the MIT Global Humanities Initiative is an incubator for Humanities 2.0, an attempt to reinvigorate, to reimagine the humanities along three vectors: in deep space, studying all cultures and expanding our repertoires beyond the usual Euro-American horizon; in deep time, studying the deep roots and the heritage of our histories around the world. And the third vector is to turn the humanities to address the urgent global challenges of our time. No? Our motto is an enhanced version of the MIT motto, Mens Manus et Cor. When MIT was founded, it was actually mind and hand. And added to that is also the heart, joining IQ, EQ, emotional intelligence, and also action. So we are a kind of a think and action tank. And our own motto is Legacies for Our Future, where we want to set a compass on promoting human flourishing now and creating good legacies for the future of humankind and our planet. No? Now, with this forum series, we very much invite you to join as we are really setting out with a lot of different projects. And I want to briefly show you our website and our gestalt. Just wait here. Let me see. I have this here. Mhm. Mhm. Let me see. So, can you see this? This is our website, and you can see some trailers here and things you can look over. And this is us. This is an eye projected on a Buddhism, Garland Sutra Buddhism mandala that symbolizes the interdependence of all beings and things. And here you can see that we are organized along what we call pillars. These are project groups that basically pick up big challenges, big topics. And the first one here is one of the biggest. That's one of the key aims of our initiative, certainly the good life, religions, philosophies, and sciences, human flourishing. And then you see here all kinds of different forums. Here we have neuroscientists coming in, medicine and healing arts, good governance in bad times. That's exactly today's forum. Environment, biodiversity, planetary stewardship, music across borders, humans and their literatures, heritage, memory, and identity, and then public literacy, civic systems, media, and emotional intelligence. And for this year, we will be going through all these pillars and have forums on them. So stay tuned for the next fall when we'll be continuing. Actually, we'll have one more forum of the public literacies pillar actually in July. So stay tuned for that. And today we are here hosting this forum on good governance in bad times. And just very briefly here, what I wanted to show you. So here you can see that all these pillars are devoted to really big motivations, now big challenges. And this pillar in particular, here we study models of governance that have historically promoted cooperation, human flourishing. Oh, sorry, yeah, I'm just jumping. Um, and social justice. And with new comparative knowledge of concepts and practices of governance in deep time and space, we can analyze why political systems break down and how we can build them to perform better and endure. And here are our guiding questions and goals and actions. We'll be talking about that in a moment. I should mention that the government pillar is actually quite big and has several working projects. So the pillars are big topics, big topic groups, and under them we are running projects that are very concrete. And today's forum is devoted to the Comparative Diplomacies for Global Governance project that we'll be talking about more. We also have a project here, and I think Professor Kono from Tokyo, from Waseda University is here. I'm running this program, this project with her and with colleagues from Korea University on 3 millennia of diplomatic craft in East Asia. This is actually workshops we are doing and also publications. We also have an amazing project on athletes, equality, and diplomacy by Greg Nod and Lenny Muller, who really go from Greece all the way to the present. And these will be subject of another forum in the fall, actually. So we're delighted to have them there. So you are invited very much to think with us, to imagine what we can be doing with these projects as we're setting out. We are also inviting participants for workshops, for podcasts we're doing. So in that sense, it's very much kind of a workshopping of our pillar of this particular project and an invitation to you to join. So today we'll have brief presentations by our pillar coordinators. Oh, here's actually Professor Kono, whom I just announced, but she's just joining here. We'll have brief pitches by our coordinators, and then we have two very special guests. Consul Minji Baek, who's actually the consul of the Republic of Korea in Boston. And she is amazing. I'll introduce her later because she has also worked for the UNESCO. And I have a lot of admiration for her work and for the way she talks and thinks about the world, about humans, about our challenges. So we are extremely delighted to have her today. And second, we'll have Professor Giles Scott Smith from Leiden, from the Leiden College, University at The Hague. And he is an absolute trailblazer in actually doing what we later started doing because he founded a journal called Diplomatica, which is really a trailblazer in rethinking how diplomatic studies are done and how they also brought really into the world and into making change with that and how to diversify these studies. So I'm extremely delighted to have Giles here because I really admire his trailblazing activities and his work, and I'll say more about that later. And after our guest speakers, we'll be actually opening up for Q&A, and we have about 1.5 hours now. Wonderful. We'll now start with our pillar coordinator pitches, and I would like to call on Johannes Makar here. Johannes actually just graduated this year from Harvard, from Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. He is a Kluge Fellow at the John W. Kluge Center and is actually working on the forgotten Renaissance, the Nahda in Arabic, in the Arabic world. And his research is so unique because he focuses on the role of religious minorities in the history of Arabic intellectual thought and print culture. He's also already working on another project on Southeast Asian print culture, actually, in comparison. So he's in many ways a real model of our youngest, extremely strong members of the Global Humanities Initiative here, doing this kind of comparative work. So, Johannes, please take it away.
Thank you, Kip, for that generous introduction. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and share some of the work that we're doing here, and most of all, my excitement for being part of this wonderful community of scholars. I'll briefly highlight two projects that I'm involved in. The first is a podcast that we're currently developing with Wiebke Denneke and Michael Pewitt, both present here. And the second is a project that I'm hoping to design further within the framework of the pillar on good governance in bad times. So the podcast is titled, or tentatively titled, "The Art and Science of Diplomacy," and is to bring together scholars, diplomats, and cultural practitioners around the question of the ways in which cultural and literary forms have informed exchanges between states and communities. So instead of thinking about diplomacy centered around hard interest treatises, we're curious to explore the various ways in which cultural practices, whether it's tulips in the 18th century Ottoman Empire or courtly poetry across dynasties, have played in bringing together communities. And that is to recognize ultimately that diplomacy is, to a great extent, perhaps an imaginative practice, something informed by shared languages, storytelling, and other ritualized forms of engagement. And we believe that by bringing people together in these in a podcast, we uh, might well arrive at interesting insights, not just with regards to diplomacy, but perhaps what it means to be human. Um, and the second project that I'm contributing to is really is closer to my own primary research project. As Vipka already mentioned, I explore the role that minorities play in 19th century Arabic intellectual thought. I focus primarily on Christians in Egypt. And the question that really drives me here is to understand or explore the ways in which the exchange of knowledge in this period that's often studied either through the lens of sectarianism or the lens of modernization, how the influx of new information, new technologies, we can think about printing as one major one, helped reframe both the role of minorities in the social fabric of the Middle East on the one hand, but also the very boundaries that define them. And what I'm um, currently exploring is the opportunity of organizing a workshop that brings together scholars working on other minorities in other historical contexts to try to recenter minorities not simply as intermediaries or marginal actors in social history, but really as actors in their own right. And so, if anyone is working on topics that resonate with this, I would love to hear from you, or if you have any thoughts on how to uh, develop this, I would likewise be very excited. So, in short, very excited to be here and looking forward to continuing this conversation today and well beyond. Thank you. And I think I'll pass it on to Michael after Wipke's introduction. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Johannes. That was a wonderful introduction. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Pewitt, the Walter C. Klein Professor of Chinese History and Anthropology. He's also the director of the Asia Center at Harvard University and has been a big force also in religious studies and mythology studies and many other areas at Harvard. He's the author of The Ambivalence of Creation, Debates Concerning Innovation and Artifice in Early China, and also has a fantastic book on how to become a god. Cosmology, Sacrifice, and Self-Demonization in Early China. It's an amazing book. You can try the recipes in there for self-demonization. But it's really about, it's also very important in our context because it draws comparisons with Greece and talks also about the question of the relationship between humans and gods and transcendence and how that really influences societies and what they think about humans and how they are humans. And he's most famous, of course, for the fact that he teaches the second most popular course at Harvard. It still is that, I think, Michael, no? 900 students in Chinese ethics are so excited. Only macroeconomics, has more people on this, and there's a wonderful book based on that, co-written with Christina Gross-Low, The Path: What Chinese Philosophers Can Teach Us About the Good Life. Wonderful book out there. Michael, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Vibeke, for the much too nice introduction. And thank you at a larger level for all that you are doing in putting this together. It's an honor to work with you, Vibeke, and Johannes on this government pillar. And as Vibeke mentioned, the government pillar consists of many, many different strands. So it's an honor to be working with all of you. So let me begin just with some general views about the overall project, and then more specifically, some of the things I'm hoping to bring to the table. So, in terms of the larger argument that Vibeke is bringing to this entire vision of the Global Humanities Project, one of the problems that we as humans tend to fall into is we tend to accept the world that we're living in as kind of the way things are. We tend to just accept it as reality. And even in moments, and I think we can all agree we're living in one, of incredible crisis where the sense is that world we're living in is no longer working, the question is always, okay, but what else is there? Because if you're growing up thinking the world we're living in is reality, you restrict the levels of possibilities that could possibly be brought to a larger discussion. So our larger project is trying to answer these problems, which is a grand claim, but here's the argument. The view is people, humans, have been wrestling with issues for thousands and thousands of years. Luckily, in the written record, we have access to over 3,000 years of these attempts. And people, in terms of the governance pillar, have been asking, how do we build effective forms of governance? How do we build worlds where human beings flourish? You have huge bodies of theories debated for millennia. And of course, many of these have been put into practice, and you can see in practice what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, what are the potentials that did play out, what are the potentials that did not play out. And as you trace the level of these debates, you see attempts to put things in practice, rework them, shift them. All of this is an extraordinary repertoire of things we could be learning from. Why do we not learn from them? It's because, going back to my opening point, we tend to accept the world we're living in, which we often will use the term modern to explain, as being somehow distinctive. Everything I just mentioned that came before this is called tradition. And traditional worlds are seen by definition as things we couldn't learn from, right? They're fun, intriguing things we can find exotic pieces of if we go to a museum, but by definition, by our way of thinking about history, we don't think they are things we can learn from. So our goal is to say, what if we are completely wrong in this? What if, of course, we can learn from these things? And what if we actually try to actively bring a larger world historical, global, comparative perspective to these various attempts and really try to rethink our world accordingly. So our goals are dramatic and huge, and yet we think this is absolutely where we need to go to work through the current sets of crises. So, moving now to the much more specific question for today of diplomacy, let me just give one very quick example of what we're hoping to bring to the table. So, in terms of worlds we accept as simply being what they are, in other words, a current configuration that we accept as reality, that reality in terms of the world of diplomacy is clear, and yet the danger is we tend to simply accept that this is the only way to organize the world. So we have organized the world according to nation states. That vision, of course, arose in Europe relatively recently. It's really only in the 20th century, in the post-World War II period, that this goes global. Building the idea that every single group should be defined as a homogeneous nation. That homogeneous nation should have its own state with rigid borders. Anyone who does not fit into that nation becomes defined as a minority, hopefully with some kind of constitutionally guaranteed rights, but even so, they're still a minority. And of course, if those constitutionally guaranteed rights are not put into practice, the implications, as we know, can be absolutely horrific. And then in terms of the interrelations between these states, you have overarching governing systems that define diplomatically how they can work, that define economically what are the acceptable modes of exchange between them. Now, We understand clearly why this was seen as a powerful way to reorganize the world after World War II. This is, of course, the end of the European imperial period. This vision is seen as a way to liberate the world from those imperial powers, to allow colonies to become nation states. So the liberatory power of this is very clear. We now, after 75 years or so of this, are seeing the clear dangers, which is precisely that you are defining nations as homogeneous. You are creating these rigid borders. You are preventing any kind of exchange except at those that are pre-given according to some international order. And cutting out from this are all of the sorts of movements and ways of learning that used to occupy much of the world. So in my concluding moments, let me just give a counter example to whet your appetite of what we're hoping to bring to the table. So, for much of East Asian history, none of what I have just been describing existed. So, there were courts. Courts were not defined as being a homogeneous nation. The courts ruled over a territory. That territory was not provided by any or even pre-decided by some kind of border. Usually, these can be thought of as courts that operated some degree of control over immediate areas and less over areas that moved farther from the court. There was no attempt not only to provide a clear border, but also, and for the exact same reason, no attempt to control things like trade, the movements of people. Often the goal of courts was to bring more people in, so to provide policies that would draw people in, bring more trade in, and courts, in terms of their interrelations, often would work in terms of, using a term very broadly, ritual. And you would have ritual connections. The reason I'm using this word in a kind of odd tone of voice is it's not a ritual in the way we tend to think of these practices. Rituals in East Asia were often intentionally designed to be arenas in which different voices, different positions are given a place, in which you are trying to actually learn from other people in the ritual context by breaking your normal mode of relations, which means the courts often at their best would operate according to a means in which you're actively trying to connect and learn from other courts. Now, I don't want to paint an overly romantic picture of this. There were certainly many examples where it did not work this way. That's not our concern. Our concern is to say, are there elements of this that are powerful that we can build upon? Where are the dangers of this? Where did that play out in dangerous ways? And what can we learn from that? In other words, instead of saying, but of course, there were still wars, so this doesn't work, the question was rather, what did work? What did not work? What can we learn from this? What can we bring to the present world? And if we are in a moment, and we clearly are, where the current nation state system is in a crisis, are there real potentials that we could use from these examples to bring to the present day to rethink our current world? So these are our goals. They are grand, they are ambitious. And our view is we are at a moment in history where dealing with these big questions is absolutely crucial. So thank you all so much for being here, and my deep thanks again to Vibke and Johannes for being part of this project.
Thank you so much, Michael. As you say, the moment is grand, the challenges are grand, and in that sense, it's very important to do these kind of bold projects now. Uh, Thanks, Johannes and Michael, for laying out really the broad framework, and Michael for going into the courts already. I am actually going to show you some very specific types of things we are also looking at. And this is also explains a little bit how I came to questions of diplomacy, namely through poetry and the fascination with the fact that in East Asia, really for millennia, no, it was the practice when you visited the foreign courts to be composing poetry together. And so I'll be talking a little bit about these things in particular, not because these details are important, but these are just examples really to showcase the rich type of cultural history the treasure house of human experience here with diplomacy that we can uncover, no, and then really learn from inductively, no. So here, one of the goals is, of course, to get from new diplomacy studies, which has been kind of a term, to new diplomacy practices through the comparative and historical work. Really, we want to be doing here. And one of the interesting things, and I would also love to hear Giles' take on that, is that I feel that over the past few years, diplomacy has gained a whole new meaning that even, for example, couples who vote different parties in the US have to talk now about actually engaging in diplomacy with each other because we live in such polarized times that diplomacy is not anymore embassies, states, but is also used for intercommunity, interpersonal, and other kind of contexts as something that's a much more conscious form of communication somehow, no? And something where negotiation is much more involved and the stakes are higher and the challenges are bigger. So I think that's just a general observation about the use, really of the term diplomacy. Um, so this is what absolutely fascinated me already quite some time ago. The phenomenon of so-called brush talk. East Asia is the last surviving and actually now dying since the 20th century logographic script sphere, where a script is used that is mostly logographic, pronounced in different vernaculars, and where basically the players in pre-modern times could all communicate through the cosmopolitan medium and lingua franca of classical Chinese, but couldn't talk to each other in vernacular languages directly. So this gave birth to this concept of, or we do the practice of brush talk, where people would be sitting here. You can see actually a delegation here of Koreans with Japanese, and they would be passing papers back and forth. And we have massive amounts of material of this kind of brush talk that is now also being researched a lot in East Asia. Just very briefly, one of the fascinating things I also discovered is how very distinctive diplomatic practices are. And I go over this very quickly. If you're more interested, I can go more into that. But East Asia has a diplomacy of literacy, very much in contrast to earlier Greece, to Rome, which is mostly through contracts. Literacy here, where you needed state letters and people who could be composing poetry and things like that, and direct contact now collectively. We also have, like in other tribute empires that are very hierarchical, very non-Westphalian, mission diplomacy, often disparagingly called goodwill missions, as if they weren't really diplomacy, where these kind of missions are expected by the higher powers. But this needs to massive amounts of knowledge diplomacy because you have a lot of people going back and forth where people exchange knowledge about anything from how to build Buddhist statues to newest discoveries in statecraft, in medicine, in poetry. And this is exactly then cast, into brush talk. And Japan, for example, is really a culture which, between the 7th and the 9th century was building an entire kind of empire and a state and a society based on these few missions with people with that kind of high level type of knowledge diplomacy of mission diplomacy, with China. I'll actually jump over that. What is interesting is you have very different types of genres that are being written in the context of diplomacy, and I'm working on that now. And one thing that's also so important when Michael talked about, these states that are monolithic there, I also, felt like it's so important to emphasize the importance of the region. We have been jumping from the critique of the nation state to the local, which is important, but we have often forgotten the regions and the incredible variety within regions. And in East Asia, what's so interesting is that Korea, for example, the relationship between Korea and China was very hierarchical, Japan and China, but Korea and Japan, which were both vassal, well, not vassals, of course, not vassals, but it's a complicated relationship, Korea more so than Japan, but basically had to send missions to China for parts of their history. They always fought over who's the best. They were not, writing with an awareness of, the venerable civilization of China and their relationship that would be of inferior status. No, so there's enormous differences even in the genres they're using, the way they're writing, as opposed to here the missions between Korea and Japan. Between the 17th and the 19th century, there were 12 missions going back and forth. And I'm currently translating quite a bit of this poetry, although there's massive amounts, so just small amounts I'm translating. This is the typical way these missions went. And I'm just showing you this, for impressions. We have travelogues, fascinating ones. We have these so-called matching poetry collections. And typically in Japan, you had these lower level domain school officials, like this guy Matsui Karaku, I'm going to show you a poem in a moment, who were welcoming actually the envoys and then composing poetry. And it resulted in this, which is certainly not world literature, respectfully, I beg to state in the presence, blah, blah, blah. And, my name is this. And in the end, he says, I humbly beg for your precious nation scholarship and poetry. If in brush talk we simply emulate them, the Koreans. Now, that indeed would be great pleasure. You see a lot of these kind of polite formulas, but also sometimes a lot of wit. And of course, the interesting thing is that that kind of poetry was sometimes written in moments where there were actually political tensions, no, and there were still those kind of politenesses, which frankly, even if it's a ritual performance, do cement more peace. And as I always like to say, people who know me, who know me talking about diplomacy, if you have written poetry with somebody, it's much harder to kill them. If you only had, have made a contract with them, you have never seen them. You have never seen generations of actually, often the ambassadors were actually running in families, and then the next generations were meeting. That is a form of kind of really working towards more peaceful conflict resolution strategies now. Here, really going into deeper history. And one thing, this is, you don't need to understand this fully, but the Koreans and Japanese were really fighting over who can use the coolest rhyme. Now, even if you don't know Chinese characters, this is a very difficult character. And the Korean was putting it out there like, oh, the Japanese probably has no idea what he's talking about, what that word means. No. So you really see this kind of, it's called wenjan in Chinese, that kind of fight, literally fight, no, over one-upmanship. Different artistic representations we can study. And what's so fascinating is that 8 years ago, these materials from the Korean and Japanese embassies were actually registered as UNESCO Memory of the World. And here are these different documents and also some, paintings, poems, all kinds of things. And what's so interesting is here in the nomination document, that the nominator said this is a model for all people of the present age seeking to establish peaceful relations by overcoming conflicts and warfare. It's not limited to the study of the relationship between Korea and Japan. At some moment, they even claim and say the fact that Korea and Japan had peace between the early 17th century and the 19th century until the annexation of Korea by Japan in the 20th century has to do with those kind of human relationship based, relationally based types of diplomatic practices now. And what's so interesting too is that these missions are being reenacted now. So you have people along the road I showed you where you have a lot of museums and little archives, county archives sometimes that have these materials where people from Japan and Korea work together to research them, they reenact. All of this is really building a kind of heritage and memory culture that ensures more peaceful relations for sure, no? So one of the interesting questions here, and Joseph Nye, whom we would have wanted to actually interview about soft power, who coined soft power, Joseph Nye, he recently passed. But one of the questions that has kept me busy thinking is that soft power is often connected with aggressive nation branding, and the projection of that, as if that's nations who can otherwise not be so powerful. But the question is, how can we develop more global shared forms of soft power, no, that are not just kind of self-promotion with a hard edge, no? And how can we study, identify, and then adapt past cultural practices of diplomacy that enhance chances of peaceful conflict resolution, promote knowledge exchange, knowledge diplomacy, and human and planetary flourishing, no? So this is just concrete examples of the types of cultural diplomacy. And the more I talk to people working in other parts of the world, or I do that myself, the more I discover there are very distinctive practices in different periods in world history that really deserve, deep study. And that's what we want to be doing with our project now. So, just a few words now about the concrete project we are doing, especially as we are inviting you also to join. Johannes already mentioned the podcast idea, now the art and science of diplomacy. Michael, you want to add something to that? We're just getting started, and our first podcast interviewee will actually be the Consul General of South Korea in Boston, Kim Tae-wi. So we'll be starting with that, and we are starting to come up with a list of people. We want to be very transsectoral, from diplomats to people who study diplomacy and so on. Michael, do you want to say more things? Especially because you, as a director of the Asia Center at Harvard, you have been interviewing a lot of ministers from different Asian countries and so on. I think it would be great if you could add to the ideas we have for the podcast.
Oh, a pleasure. And just to underline what Vibeke and Johannes have mentioned, one of the hopes of the podcast series is precisely that we found podcasts to be a wonderful way to reach a very, very large audience. And precisely if we can bring in lots of different figures, people actively involved in diplomacy, figures who are working on different moments in world history when diplomacy operated in ways that would be very exciting to bring to the table, comparative discussions of the present day with different moments in the past. So our hope is to run a series of these, bringing together a lot of people who oftentimes would not be brought together, and precisely to bring out these much larger questions. So we very much look forward to these, and we very much look forward to hearing any of your ideas of potential topics and or people we might want to bring on.
Yes, thank you, Michael. I should also mention here, since I see Michael Jacobson here on the call and also Rick Eberhard, who are actually the running the game lab in the Media Lab at MIT, and they work on the public literacies. They're coordinators of the public literacies pillar. We'll have a forum in July, and we are working together on a game, developing a game that instead of promoting conquering, killing, and possessing, actually promote negotiating, befriending, and making compromises and win-win situations. So you'll be hearing from them. And it's wonderful that they're here. If you have questions for them, you can also ask them now. One other project that we are developing is, apart from actually publications we'll be doing and white papers, is a collaborative project with another institution I want to briefly mention, because that is a very important partner now also for the Global Humanities Initiative as a whole. And this is the so-called Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, GESTA, which is a think tank that was founded in 2018, I think, by the Swiss government and also Geneva, of course, in the ecosystem, the very pregnant ecosystem of Geneva. And what GESTA is doing is to bring together scientists and scholars, diplomats, politicians, philanthropists, thought leaders, NGOs, citizens, and to basically anticipate breakthroughs across many different fields and say, what is going to happen in the next 5, 10, 25 years in all these different sectors? And how can we then converge the different sectors of society and globally, and also accelerate change on our aching planet? And the way they do this is through something I want to show you here briefly, the so-called radar. this is an amazing tool. They have been running workshops with thousands of scholars in many different fields, and you can actually look up these different fields where you'll have anticipation of breakthroughs. So far, obviously, science has been very important. So quantum physics, they just launched a think tank, on quantum physics, neurosciences, eco-augmentation. But I'm glad to report to you as of this week, actually, that JESTA is going to add a whole new area, the humanities and social sciences, called planetarized humanity. And the Global Humanities Initiative has been invited to serve as a blueprint, to be expanded actually to build a radar like that. We'll be doing that starting this fall into next year, and it's going to be launched in 27. This is all new information. And it's also going to be presented at the summit in Geneva in 2025, where a thousand of politicians and diplomats and scientists and so on come together at invitation of philanthropists to accelerate knowledge across many sectors for systemic urgent change. No, so for them, this is now what I wanted to say. We have discussed to develop actually online materials that are almost like an online exhibit and also teaching materials where people can learn about many different diplomatic cultures across time and space. And the ultimate goal, which we'll see whether we can accomplish that, would be to develop a certificate based on this kind of global, historically informed diplomatic studies for leadership training across many different areas, from people in comparative historical studies, but also to diplomats and politicians and so on, where you would be able to get that certificate officially also through MIT and MIT GHI. But that's the current plan. No? So I'm now opening up our event here to our special guests and would like to introduce Professor Giles Scott Smith, who is Professor of Transnational Relations and New Diplomatic History. I think you're probably quite unique in having that title. And I noticed you had several titles and chairs that have to do with new diplomatic history and also the diplomatic history of Atlantic cooperation since World War II. So Giles is really the man of the moment, talking about the transatlantic relationship. I'm in Europe right now too. He has been the academic director of the Roosevelt Institute for American Studies in Middelburg, the Netherlands, and the chair also in New Diplomatic History at Leiden, and is now dean at Leiden University College, The Hague. And in 2017, he founded what I already mentioned, Diplomatica, a journal of diplomacy and society. And that's how I discovered him, because I felt, wow, there's a journal out there who's already doing the kind of things I would love to be reading. And you're really kind of have been working ahead, and we very much look forward to further collaborations. But for now, I would like to invite you to talk a little bit about new diplomatic studies and the future of the field. Giles, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Wiebke and team, and really a pleasure to be here. What for me is afternoon, maybe a different time zone for some of you. Yeah, I apologize in advance. I notice sometimes my image may freeze. Hopefully, my audio will continue uninterrupted. Yeah, I'd just like to give a brief pitch of who we are, the New Diplomatic History Network, and what we're really about. And it's really about reframing the study and thinking about diplomacy, and in a way that connects people who would otherwise not be connected. And I think that's the real basis of any good network, is that it's bringing in input and individuals who would not otherwise meet. Now, the history of our network goes back to the late 2000s, a period when international history and global history were becoming very prominent in the field. And there was a sense among some that this very valuable turn to global history was losing touch with what diplomacy is, what it does, what its very characteristics may be, because the scale of history was getting so big. It was losing that diplomatic interface in terms of how negotiations are conducted and between whom. And that really led to the formation of the new Diplomatic History Network in 2012. And what was very interesting about that moment was that it was a very multinational group of predominantly young scholars, European based. The one thing that I've always really found valuable about the network is that it's largely bottom up. It's with all respect, it's not being led by leaders in the field. It's coming up from PhDs, postdocs, young researchers who were searching for ways and inspiration to study diplomacy in different ways. So, what's the network about? Well, very briefly, it's really based on a reframing of diplomacy along spatial, temporal, and behavioral lines. Spatial, I think it's very evident in terms of this particular seminar, getting out of the European diplomatic box, really kind of trying to appreciate the importance of diplomacy, how it's developed in other parts of the world, and really kind of mapping that onto the kind of, if you like, traditional orthodox European model. It's also on a smaller scale, reinvestigating the sites and spaces where diplomacy takes place and everything that happens in particular places, be it conferences or informal meetings. It's the spaces that are worthy of attention. Temporal, the one most valuable element for us has been linking early modernists with modernists. Early modern historians, that is such a tremendous innovatory field in terms of thinking through on what diplomacy is, how it's been conducted, and by whom, because of course the early modern in a European perspective is basically a much more fluid space of time than the modern as it's traditionally been seen. I actually disagree with that, but that is how it's traditionally been seen. But of course, temporarily as well, it's like I say, it's getting outside of the European sense of diplomatic time and engaging with scholars and experts who can give us a very different sense of diplomatic time from a different region of the world, such as Asia Pacific, for instance. And then behavioral, reinvestigating the diplomat. We don't want to lose touch with who diplomats are, obviously. So then there is a reinvestigation of what are the social milieu of diplomats? What is their training? What are the kind of materials that diplomacy relies on, and how does that figure into behaviors and procedures over time? So those three areas are really the areas where we look to reframe diplomacy. And another key element is the broadness of our disciplinary base. We are, of course, fundamentally historical in orientation, but the interchange with social scientific theories and thinking is extremely important. Recently, a couple of weeks ago, we had our sixth conference in Aix-en-Provence, lovely location, I have to say, based at the Sciences Po location. And we had such a cross section, geographers, anthropologists, sociologists, international relations experts, all of whom kind of debating the whole concept of diplomacy through time with historians. And that is such a rich engagement, so that even we have about 120 papers at our conferences. That seems to be a nice, we've kind of leveled out now at that number. It's a very nice size, I have to say, for a conference. And every single panel that was organized, pretty much anyone could walk in, regardless of the topics that's being discussed and regardless of your disciplinary background, and you can engage with the people who are speaking. And that I find to be a really special element to our network. In 2017, as Vipka mentioned, we had our third conference, and there was a sense that, okay, now we've established a good enough body of diverse, committed scholars that we could go for the journal. And that was the formation, where I can't get it in focus now. There we are. Of course, it's backwards probably for you. But this is Diplomatica, a journal of diplomacy and society. We're now in our seventh volume. And we are now, since last year, accredited on Scopus and Web of Science. We're very happy about that. So we do feel that the spread of articles in the journal has really shown that there are a lot of people out there who really find it useful to have a journal that is prepared to publish very, very different perspectives on diplomacy with a historical angle. There are, of course, journals in the diplomatic studies field that are very varied, but they often lack that historical background. And by really pushing the study of diplomacy back through time, but engaging it through the latest methods, data science, social scientific methodologies, and so on, we find, oh, yes, this is an extremely rich field. So just to round off, we are now in a situation where we can look ahead to our 7th conference. It will be in Bilbao in 2 years' time. Looks like there is a strong coalition building to take it to Lund after that. We are, I must admit, still very much European based. We would very much like to engage with scholars in other parts of the world. We do have North American participants, but we would be quite happy to expand our range. And we certainly have published some very good articles on the history of Asia-Pacific diplomacy through time. Also, lastly, I have put in the chat our website title, newdiplomatichistory.org. We are officially an organization, and that is where you can pick up the latest news from the network. And we have also recently moved off X, and we're now on Bluesky. So if you would like to engage, that is a prime social media channel for us. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'll be happy to take any questions later.
Thank you so much, Giles. It was wonderful to hear the prehistory of the journal, actually, and how the network arose. So I'm very glad to have heard that from you. Thank you for sharing. We will now proceed to our second special speaker here, Consul Beck, and she will be speaking about the power of soft power in the case of South Korea. She received her education at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul and entered the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for South Korea of the Republic of Korea in 2015. And one thing that makes her very distinctive is that she has worked in many different areas of the world, but also with the UNESCO division, now as the second secretary. She has been in charge of the World Heritage Committee and the executive board, involved in the executive board of the UNESCO, and we'll be talking about that too. In addition, she has been the second secretary for the Hispanic America Cooperation Division, and also actually worked in India, the second secretary in the Korean embassy in India, in New Delhi, 2018 to 2020. And in 2024, she actually came to Boston and is now the consul there in the consulate. And I'm very delighted, Consul Beck, that you're here. We have met on various occasions, and I've really developed deep admiration for you as a diplomat, as a thinker, as a human being, as a woman leading things. And I'm delighted to listen to your pitch today. Please take it away.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this event, and thank you, Vika, for a very kind introduction. It's great pleasure to meet you and speak with you today. I'd like to talk about Korea's cultural diplomacy in today's world, specifically how Korea builds and exercises soft power. As many of you know, Korea is a relatively small country in Asia, both in land and population, surrounded by powerful neighbors like China, Japan, and Russia. In this context, Korea has taken a strategic approach to diplomacy, not through military or economic dominance, but by investing in soft power. Soft power is a term coined by Professor Joseph Nye. It is the ability to shape the preferences of others through appeal and attraction rather than coercion or payment. For Korea, culture has become the core of that appeal. What's interesting is that Korea's cultural diplomacy didn't begin as a top-down government policy. It actually started from the bottom up. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Korean dramas and music began gaining popularity in neighboring Asian countries. Over time, they reached audiences in the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas. This movement wasn't driven by government. It was led by entertainment companies, passionate fans, and vibrant global online communities. Recognizing this growing influence, the Korean government stepped in to support it more systematically. It invested in cultural experts, opened Korean culture centers all over the world, and sponsored international events from K-pop festivals and Korean language contests to taekwondo competitions and culinary programs. Right here in New England, my consulate actively hosts and supports cultural events. For example, last May, the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem opened the Yugil Korean Gallery, named after the first Korean international student to the United States in the late 19th century. We are also collaborating with the Worcester Red Sox to host a Korean Heritage Night on August 22. What makes Korea's cultural diplomacy truly special is that it's not one-sided or aggressive. We are not pursuing our culture onto others. We are sharing it, opening our hearts, creating mutual understanding, and simply bring people joy. I remember staying in Spain 15 years ago as an international student. Back then, I often had to explain where I was from. I'd say I'm from South Korea and I speak Korean. And people still didn't quite understand the difference between North and South Korea, or why I didn't speak Chinese or Japanese, but Korean. But today, the world knows BTS, Blackpink, the Korean series like Squid Game, movie Parasite, and Korean food, and even languages. There is a growing curiosity and affection for Korean culture, and that I believe is one of our most valuable diplomatic assets. Culture diplomacy isn't only important as a national strategy, it's also a powerful reminder of the values we should embrace as global citizens. Through it, we meet people from different backgrounds, we learn about them, and slowly we begin to understand them. This process nurtures mutual respect, empathy, and inclusiveness. When these values take root, we become better equipped to navigate the challenges of this complex era. Some might ask, why is this important in diplomacy? Diplomacy is usually seen as something that happens between governments or countries, but I believe it really starts with people. When we think of a country, we often imagine land, borders, maybe even a flag, but a country is more than that. It is a community and a collection of people. Whether we are diplomats, students, scholars, or everyday citizens, we are its representatives. Take like this, what if you're working in foreign service and assigned to a country you don't or do particularly like? Or what if the people of country A dislike or like the people of country B? Wouldn't that influence the direction of foreign policy? That's why relations between individuals matter so much. The way we treat and understand each other can have a very real impact on how our countries relate on a larger scale. In this context, learning about and appreciating other cultures becomes essential. Diplomacy, sharing our traditions, ideas, and values, builds trust, breaks down stereotypes, and creates space for genuine connection. And I believe that kind of understanding is where true diplomacy begins. As we continue to grow in this interconnected world, let us remember true power lies not in domination but in connection. Thank you. 감사합니다.
Thank you so much for really this strong argument, which in academic circles is now usually called relationality, no? Relationality studies, where I always felt like, what does that really mean? It is about the importance of human relationships from our neurological wiring to our family systems, to our social systems, political systems. And Korea is a great example for that, and also a real hero of soft power, no? Absolutely soft power. So that's why it's particularly wonderful to have that as an example here of soft power with a hard edge that can actually make huge changes in the world, as you described. Thank you so much. We'll now open up for questions, for comments, for projects you might be doing you want to bring up, or any other kind of observations you would like to share.
Do we raise our hands or do we just start speaking?
Please, Mikael.
Okay. So thank you for the presentations. First of all of you, this was super interesting. I have a lot of thoughts, but I think the one I landed on was when you, Vipke, were talking about these sort of pre-Western colonialism ideas of how to conduct diplomacy that kind of got washed away with the sort of early 20th century European idea of diplomacy. I wonder if that was much more broadly in practice than just the examples that you have from like China and Japan. Maybe that was more of a like dominant form of diplomacy, was this kind of cultural diplomacy. And just as one example of what made me think that was a long time ago, I watched a presentation of the emergence of doo-wop music in the United States. And it came from the streets of New York. And it was a way for street gangs to not basically have to fight each other with fists and knives or whatever, but they were instead doing these doo-wop battles that we since have seen replicated in hip hop music and so on. And we've also seen it when me and Rick have been playing games made by people who try to convey other cultures' way of doing things. We've seen that in indigenous peoples from North America and how they used sharing of food and artifacts as a form of cultural diplomacy. Was was this the dominant form of diplomacy everywhere before we kind of washed it away, you think? Will we just find examples of it everywhere when we start looking?
That's an excellent question. And I love it in particular because cultural diplomacy, public diplomacy is kind of the weak sibling, the poor cousin of real diplomacy. That, I mean, we have to face that. That's the real challenge. And you're almost making the argument like it could be that it was the other way around. Not that there would have been already, the Westphalian model really. But that's an excellent question. I have some ideas about that, but why don't we start with Giles? Perhaps you want to say a little bit about that, or Michael, or whoever would like to address that, Johannes?
Sure, I'm happy to come in to start with. Mikhail, yeah, basically, you're right. Because if you take the orthodox understanding of diplomacy, as I think Michael explained, as involving interstate relations, that only goes back a certain length of time into history. Yet peoples have been in contact and in exchange and dialogue for centuries, indeed millennia. So, how did they do that? Well, often through the activities that you have just mentioned. In other words, diplomacy has evolved over time into a form which we now take for granted, but which is what we take for granted now is just one very narrow window onto an understanding of diplomacy. And I think your question is very interesting because cultural diplomacy, as I think all of us know, is it's important, but in terms of the study of diplomacy over time, it's often seen as a bit of a sideshow. It's often seen as the nice kind of colorful edges of the serious negotiating stuff that really decides relations between states. Whereas if you take the perspective you've sketched, it's actually the other way around. That in fact it's those more informal, more kind of loose frameworks for establishing contact between peoples that is actually the framework over time. And that on top of that, or however you want to see it, superimposed on that, has come the state-to-state official diplomacy, which has then, because of the nature of the international system, effectively dominated our attention. So I do like for me, that's the classic kind of reframing of diplomacy over time and what we're looking at. So thank you very much for that.
Great. Any other of the speakers? Anybody else who would like to say something on this? It's a really great question. No? Anybody else? So just to add to that, I think, if we put out materials there about other diplomatic cultures, this is a perfect way to start to say this was kind of the main mode. And what is very interesting there is, of course, there's so many different types of diplomacy also in these spaces that are spaces of contact that are much more, undefined. You have messenger diplomacy in cases of like imminent war, for example. That's a different type of diplomacy, of course, from the kind of goodwill missions that would be kind of a roll call every year now from higher powers or empires to actually have their vassals or, their other peripheral states, come and so on. And depending on that, there's real difference there. But what's interesting there is I'm just thinking of the Shahnameh, which is the great, one of the biggest epics of the world, the great book of Kings from the Persian tradition, of earlier Persia. And this is, I've been studying that because it's full of vignettes of diplomacy. And there you really, diplomacy that reaches from so Rome, basically, and Europe now, all the way, into India and to China. And where, this question really of you have like messenger diplomacy sometimes and really war, you have, are there more kind of cultural types of activities? You have a lot of description of different diplomatic activity. And always, even if, it's about war and peace and very kind of hardcore issues, you still have attention to, and I thought of that, Giles, when you were talking, what paper were they using? How was the calligraphy? What did that kind of communicate? Very much like in East Asia too, so crucial, even in these kind of very urgent moments now. And so that's just one indicator also that I think once we start much more systematically, which I think hasn't been done, studying really diplomatic cultures from around the world comparatively, we'll get a much better view of that and get back to your question, or rather to almost like a hypothesis that is very intriguing. No, thank you. Oh, and one last thought there, and unfortunately, Greg Nodge is not here anymore, but that's something I have also always been thinking about in the Greek context. It is interesting, after all, that in many ways there are so many reasons why we construct, Western genealogies back to the Greeks, not the Egyptians and so on, not Alexandria, but back to the Greeks. So the Greek geography and the Greek colonization, in the seventh, ninth to the seventh century BCE, is something that is a game changer. Once you have colonization, where you have people who actually settle in other places, actually the whole dynamics kind of changes of who's representatives, who talks to whom, who's power, who's minority. And I always wonder, like, how has that actually influenced Western culture, no, of later colonization too. But the fact that really you had these Greek islands, you had Italy, you had what's nowadays Turkey, so this is Great Greece, and you had these massive colonization movements, no, that actually led to a very different type of diplomacy and of just ethnic interactions, type of cultural interactions. No, that's just an afterthought. Other questions or comments, thoughts?
If I had a question about Korea, actually, if I may, Korean cultural diplomacy, because it was very interesting how you said that it all began commercially, and that the Korean state came in at a later stage um, to because they noticed, hey, there's something going on here. Maybe we can make use of this. I wondered if you could say a bit more about that relationship, because states may not necessarily have the same interests or methods as a commercial enterprise. Has that been a smooth road, or can we learn things from that as well?
Thank you for interesting question. The relationship between the commercial areas and the government is very difficult, I believe. But there is not the much of kind of conflict of interest between the commercial areas and the government areas, because I believe that industries would like to expand their markets to the world, and they need connection network, or they need information like kind of that, and we can support them. Like we can arrange the stadium for their needs, or they have some issues with other their partners, we can actually help them. So that is not that much kind of that conflict of interest. And it is more like a cooperation and cooperating partners, because when I remember that when the president visited the Paris, France in 2017 or 18, we have a very huge K-pop festivals there. So, and in there, the entertainment companies can invite their singers or their groups, not familiar or not that much popular groups, could be participated in that kind of festival. So it is kind of, I believe, win-win in strategy for both of us. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was curious about that.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, I would actually be following up on Giles' question here, and actually put a question to everybody in the call through that. And it was so helpful to be reminded that actually the Korean wave started bottom up, because at the moment, I think Korea is one of the most amazing and actually mind-blowing cases where really the government is and academic institutions even are so much pushing things. I remember a few years ago going to a conference at the Academy of Korean Studies, which actually just philologists and epigraphers looking at materials, and they invited novel writers, film writers to look at the 문화 contents, to the cultural contents, and to basically give them documents, no, about a court case around a widow with like an amazing story, whatever, that they could spin out into stories. And this is done very systematically. And one of the interesting things about that, and one of the challenges, and this is where the question comes, is that there's so much of a heritage industry around Korean and East Asian culture, for example, Korean drama, that I always feel that Korean historical drama, which I love and I watch a lot and I also teach, is really to some degree rewriting the history of East Asia in the pre-modern period and then also in the modern period also of other regions. But for the pre-modern period, things like Queen Sondok, for example, now from the 7th century, it has to do with China too, of course, Japan and so on. And the way these dramas are being done as edutainment is more people are going to watch that than reading the historical sources. And here we have both something that's wonderful, namely people are getting interested in history. They watch these things, they might want to read books about it and so on. But here's the big challenge and question. If that replaces history, the heritage industry that comes out of a kind of creative, Queen Sondo can speak Latin all of a sudden when she's like on the Silk Road and all kinds of like crazy things that are of course completely inaccurate. There's a real danger here. Who are actually the people who can talk back to that? Historians are not studying these Korean historical dramas, which I always regret. The media study people don't have the background in history. Historians don't really do it. Nobody's there to say like, wait a minute. And it's in terms of public literacies, those kind of this heritage industry is creating a lot of awareness about history, but also creating a lot of kind of false, imagined, fictional things out there. How should we deal with that? No, I would love to hear from anybody, but I think that's a really important, very ambivalent question. No.
If I may jump in, I think you've put your finger on why the humanities are so crucial in the 21st century. Because in some ways, historians are the fact checkers and of the entertainment industry, and of course we are on the back foot on that. Because yeah, very interesting the way you put that out there. Because indeed, um, when everything in the past gets reduced to entertainment, yeah, storylines are warped in all sorts of directions. Characters are added to the scenarios who didn't exist. Accusations are made which were never made, and yeah, it is very slippery territory. And I think also with the students who we teach these days, yeah, we assume that they can differentiate, and they can't. And that is a real challenge for us. Hopefully, that will keep us busy for some years to come.
If I also could say something quickly, I think a lot about this, maybe because I teach games and games are not always the best at representing history accurately and fairly and remembering all people's perspectives and so on. But ultimately, I do think of these sort of popular culture expressions as opportunities rather than risks, because it does make people who don't necessarily have access to higher education or read a lot of history books or journals, etc., to get interested in these questions. And I do think that we can fill a role of picking up on that interest and bringing real knowledge and real consideration to these topics. But we need to meet people where they are, which might be more. I love that you're making a podcast. That's a very good medium for reaching people. I also think I watch a lot of YouTube, and there are a lot of real academics out there who are doing reaction videos or all kinds of picking up on like the new anime film or something like that, but then going deep. And I think people are willing to follow if they just find us. And I think we need to be where they are looking for content in order to be found.
Yes, I really like that you say we want to look at these things as an opportunity. I totally agree about that. An opportunity that's a hook and that draws people in and where students then, Giles, as you say, students often can't distinguish. Now, even when I teach with sources and they watch things, if we don't analyze, they don't realize often. But once they realize, they even enjoy consuming pop culture much more because they feel very empowered to actually have a critical kind of perspective. And that's fantastic. No, that's exactly, it's also the tool set of like critical thinking is really stimulated. But I wonder what, in terms of the dangers, everybody out there, what could we do for a project now under our pillar to deal with that, for example, to take the opportunities but also address the challenges? What do you think? Just creative brainstorming.
Well, I mean, you could think about analyzing, how diplomacy is portrayed in popular culture.
And then, through publications or, in podcasts, we could do a podcast thing about that. That would be really
Yeah,
great, no? To have
yeah.
have people talk about that.
Mm.
And
So,
and
yeah. Sorry, just to give one example, which I have used on my students, there was a film, I don't know, about 10 years ago or so, maybe more, about the Swedish consul who was in Paris in 1944, and the whole film was about this alleged all-night dialogue between him and the German Wehrmacht general who was in charge of the city, who had been ordered by Hitler to blow up key landmarks around the city. And the film portrays a very heroic Swedish consul who just happens to be in that place at that time with access to the person in charge of the city, and eventually persuades the general to leave Paris alone. And of course, Paris was left alone, thankfully. Um, but the film embellishes, of course, the narrative. The dialogue did take place, but there's no recording of it, obviously. So it was a kind of an embellishment. Um, and you can draw a lot from that. The heroic nature, mano a mano, the gender aspect, the power of rationality to persuade a military person not to follow the orders of their boss. Um, but of course, it's also a fabrication. So then you can go into, okay, why, what's the background to the film? Is there a kind of wider narrative going on here? So it's a nice example um, of kind of, yeah, diving into kind of how diplomacy is portrayed. And of course, you could that's a movie. You can take it into all sorts of areas. But I think that would help us understand. For us, diplomacy is a given in terms of we're pretty much talking the same language, but for many, diplomacy is kind of, what is it? Yeah, not always easy to follow.
yeah, it would be
I
great to be able
was
to add bonus materials now to movies like that. Yeah, Mikael, go ahead.
I was hoping someone else would say it, but I guess I'll say it myself. I think making games that represent these kinds of things is a great way of reaching different audiences, but also engaging in a very direct manner where you get to interact with history by playing it. Just as a quick example, we made a game about the debt crisis in Puerto Rico. It's not necessarily the sexiest of themes for a game, but I believe we were pretty successful in making something that has a very low barrier to entry. It's kind of a colorful family style game that plays in just 30 minutes. And it does, through its mechanics, rather than traditional storytelling, say something about how the debt has to be removed before global change and natural disasters basically wipe Puerto Rico off the map. So it's a very dire situation that needs to be acted on immediately by the US government. And we are just trying to create awareness. This is from last week. I was in San Juan at UPR, and we were showing the game to students and faculty and so on. And that's a little bit of a plug for what I think that we in the Game Lab can contribute to a project like this.
Thank you. So glad you showed that. And I started playing with Rig, but then we didn't have enough time. I have to come back and play more Promessa.
Please do.
Yes, yes, yes. Any other questions? We still have, I think, 2 to 3 minutes. Can I put something else out there? I hope it's not too abstract, but I thought of it, Mikael, as you were speaking. The interesting thing about games is, of course, first of all, you kind of typologize to some degree. And if that's very well done, it kind of gives you almost like a cultural GPS, no? To some degree, even if it's kind of simplified and gamified and so on. But it's almost, it gives you, you really get under the skin of actors, and it's almost like a play of virtual history, no? Where you're kind of playing out things and situations. And I wonder, and perhaps, some of our speakers today want to say something about that, or anybody else, like what the relation is to virtual history. I think virtual history doesn't have a great moment now. What I like about virtual history is not so much the doomsday type, like, what if Germany in 1933, which is, of course, also great, but more virtual history to imagine alternative positive, invigorating futures, no? And where virtual history and games, in that for that matter, no, are actually really tools, not just entertainment or so, but are almost kind of, in biotopes in which you can explore that. Any thoughts about virtual history, which I think is not is underappreciated in the field and is often more like popularized in the doomsday scenario? Any thoughts on that? How virtual history could be a great tool also to imagine those futures with different diplomatic cultures and so on.
I guess with virtual history, then you're focusing on key moments and exploring why they happened the way they did, and what an alternative outcome may have been.
Inflection points, exactly, no? Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So it's kind of a deep dive into the kind of the traditional understanding of diplomacy about power, decision making, interests, and so on. Yeah, okay. I think that's really important. I would add science fiction to that as well. Um, so virtual history being a kind of science fiction of the past, it doesn't really make sense, but you know what I mean. Um,
Yes, yes,
and I guess uh, that is definitely a very important element for generating interest. And of course, alongside that, a lot of what we're talking about today is the fact that we're looking at a very broad palette of what diplomacy is, which is much broader than that kind of negotiation.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah.
the whole representation of diplomatic activity is a huge field, and I think that's games. I fully agree. I think games are fantastic. I think developing a game though outside of that negotiation interface might be quite difficult.
Well, we'll draw you into the project.
I'd love to be part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We'll now close. Michael, Johannes, you would like to have a brief final statement or anything, and then we'll close it out.
Oh, well, I will just say thank you. This has been incredibly exciting, and I think the ideas that have already come up are wonderful. I think it is absolutely true, going back to Mikhail's point, that the fact that there is such interest in all of these historical dramas shows the interest is there. I think we have to be honest. The many of us on this call who are academics, we often write in a way that does not reach that audience. We write in a way that we're writing for 3 or 4 other specialists in our immediate field. And it means that there's this interest out there, and yet we're not reaching it. And I think these ideas of podcasts, games, virtual history, all sorts of ways where we can bring what we are learning in terms of our scholarly work to this larger audience is incredibly exciting. So I found this discussion so inspiring, and I very much look forward to the work to come. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Johannes.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. I think I see in the latter part of our discussion an invitation to rethink the way we share our findings, the way we reach audiences, the way we expand the conversation well beyond our academic circles. And I think the podcast is one way. It's very exciting to see Mikhail's work with games, and I would look forward to exploring other ways of communicating our findings and again expanding the circle of communication around these questions. So really exciting conversation today, and thank you for allowing me to be part of it.
Yes. Thank you so much. And I very much invite you to stay in touch. We have a mailing list with further events. In July, Mikhail and Rick will be leading a forum. We're still working on the date, I think, with a third coordinator. And we also have a YouTube channel, you can check in with. And I just want to emphasize that with Jessa, we'll have amazing opportunities to really come up with very creative ideas of how to put content out there and reach other audiences. So if you have ideas about that, if you're working on things where you feel like you want to try that out, you have suggestions for us, as Michael said, we are really on our way from just being academics out into the world and being makers shakers as we can be, as bold as we can be. And in that sense, we welcome you all to join us on this journey. Thank you so much and have a nice day. Bye bye.